Good evening, everyone, and welcome to our program on sanctions this evening. I'm Ann Nicol with the United Nations Association of New York. Russia's invasion of Ukraine has created the largest economic disruption in Europe so far this century. This evening, we're fortunate to have with us Peter Piatetsky, co-founder and CEO of Castleman.AI, who's going to give us an outline of the current situation, drawing on his experience with North Korean and Iranian sanctions. He will explore what sanctions can and cannot achieve and the role they might play in resolving the current situation. Peter has served at the US Treasury Department in multiple roles, including as senior policy advisor, advising the president, treasurer secretary, and other principles on sanctions, anti-money laundering, and terrorist financing. He also held a leadership role at Wori, one of Korea's largest banks, supervising all of its financial crimes compliance in the United States. So without further ado, I'm going to hand the proceedings over to Peter. Welcome, Peter.
And thank you very much for having me, and delighted to be speaking to the United Nations Association of New York. Right away, I just want to also thank all the participants and note that please don't treat this like a monologue. If you have any questions, feel free to drop them in the Q&A or raise hand. So kind of have slides, but I want to make this very accessible and answer anyone's questions. So I'll share slides, but we will be, don't worry, we'll not be reading off of them. And the first thing is just to talk a little bit about history of sanctions. So some of the oldest sanctions, if you want to go very, and the reason this says advances in modern sanctions is because the history of sanctions dates back to the ancient Greeks. They were the first to use economic blockades, and those tools were used bluntly and with various degrees of success or lack thereof for thousands of years. But modern sanctions really begin with the collapse of the Soviet Union and globalization. And the reason I say that is, and many people might disagree, but modern sanctions rely on the supremacy of the US dollar. So they rely on dollar-denominated trade. They rely on global banks. They rely on global trade. With globalization, you suddenly had global supply chains, money being sent from, let's say, Japan to New York that goes through London. So lots of financial choke points. With countries, previously when countries were doing a lot of their business and supply chains domestically, sanctions would not have that much of an effect. So sanctions also very much rely on the dollar. You have UN sanctions, US sanctions, European Union sanctions, UK sanctions. Those are your four primary sanctions regimes. And the reason for that is of the economic power of those countries. We can talk later about China. China's a very interesting case because they are very new to the sanctions game, and they actually don't really use it in the same way at all. But in the late 90s, you had sanctions on Iraq, Yugoslavia, and also Cuba, and some of the Cuba sanctions are still around today. And those sanctions were very much not targeted. They're broad. They're country-based sanctions. And they said, hey, you cannot do business with Iraq. That was it. That was basically the sanction. And there were several things that people took away from that, which was one, a lot of people said it wasn't effective. And I said Saddam is still in power. And that's often a critique of sanctions, which we'll talk about. But the other thing that people mentioned was look at all the collateral damage. Like, you can't do business with Iraq, and now people can't get medicine in Iraq, and so children are dying. And Saddam Hussein very aptly exploited this and there were articles in Western press saying, look at all the Iraqi children dying from sanctions. And although that is not why they were dying, it was an argument which heard a lot of, got a lot of press and got a lot of attention. And so from there, sanctions moved to target it. So basically governments listened, really primarily the US government, and said, okay, we're not going to just sanction a whole country and say you can't do business with a whole country. We're going to put names on lists. We're going to put names of specific individuals, names of specific companies. And that way you can still do business with a country. You can still send medicine in. You can still, let's say, buy goods that people in that country produce, but we're going to watch list every single, let's say, bad person in that country. And so that's targeted sanctions. And targeted sanctions have been used against North Korea, against Iran, against narco traffickers, against terrorists. See, there's something in the Q&A here. One moment. See what's in the Q&A. What are personal sanctions? So I've not heard the term personal sanctions, but what I think, Jane, you mean is a sanction that targets an individual. So that would be a targeted sanction. But yeah, so we moved kind of from broad country-based sanctions to targeted sanctions. And then in the late 2010s, as the US, EU, and UN were putting a lot more pressure on Iran, they came up with a new type of sanction called sectoral sanctions. And sectoral sanctions say, we are sanctioning a sector of the economy. They are very difficult to deal with because if you're saying, hey, you can't do business with Iraq, all right, pretty straightforward. If it's Iraq, no matter what, I can't touch it. I get it. Very kind of means you can't do any business with Iraq. It's very black or white. Targeted sanctions, similarly, are pretty black or white because somebody is either on a list or not on a list. And with sectoral sanctions, for example, some of the sectoral sanctions on Iran, where there was a ban on any business with Iran's mining sector. So how do you know if a company is in the mining sector? It's a very serious question. If something is called Iran Mining Organization, which there is an organization like that in Iran, that's pretty straightforward. But what if you just have something, an Iran-based company that's called Bright Elements? What if it's called, like, what if it's not obvious from the name? What if they do a lot of different types of business and one of them is mining? So sectoral sanctions essentially take all of the burden of sanctions and put them on the private sector to figure out. And this is actually another very important thing is when you read something in the news about sanctions, the government does not go out and find the money and freeze the money. The government says, hey, you private sector can't do business with these entities or people, and you have to freeze the money if you have it. And then the private sector has to file reports to the government saying, hey, we found and froze this money. So who is actually enforcing all of the sanctions? It's banks, it's fintechs, it's crypto companies. The government does not go out and find the money in regard to sanctions. They might later in a criminal case, but Treasury's Sanctions Office, OFAC, Office of Foreign Assets Control, they don't do that. So, and any additional questions at this point? We're about to dive into the data. Okay.
Peter, I just wanted to add something. You wanted, we could just hold off the questions till you're finished.
Sure. Okay. Yeah.
Because otherwise it gets kind of disruptive.
Copy. Thank you, Anne. So,
you just go ahead.
So we had broad sanctions kind of in the 90s. targeted sanctions in the 2000s and 2010s, and then sectoral sanctions, which target a sector. And so what happened with Russia is particularly interesting because you basically have all of the different types of sanctions that have been developed in the last 20 years leveled against one country over the course of about 2 weeks. So when I said this is the biggest economic disruption this century, she's absolutely right. It's a country that was part of the G8, kicked out, now it's the G7. So country that was part of the G8, part of the G20, major global economy, major financial sector, is suddenly just disconnected. And this has never happened before. I think one of the most interesting things, and when we talk about the graphs in a moment, you'll see is how united the world has really been in going after the Russian economy, looking to punish Russia. So without further ado, we'll kind of really get into it. All right, so who sanctioned Russia? So this is on the left, we have a donut chart of since February 22nd. And then total. So kind of, you can see that there's been a significant increase since then. And you can also see that these are the world's major economies, with the exception of China and India. Notably, and there's a slide later that shows this, no country in Africa or South America imposed sanctions on Russia, but there's an interesting kind of reason for that. So 141 countries voted against the war at the UN, but only 46 levied sanctions. And that seems odd, right? If your country is going to take the very drastic and major step of condemning the war at the UN, why will you then not impose sanctions? And the reason is actually, there's of course the question of political will, but there's also a very bureaucratic reason. And with sanctions, there's often minutia that really gets in the way of things, if you will. Most countries do not have their own sanctions programs. So when we hear about sanctions, and we think US sanctions usually, of course, because we're in the US, or UN. The UN has a sanctions committee. They have a charter that says the UN can impose sanctions. They have a process. Same for the US, Canada, UK, EU. There's an entire process for doing that. Most countries in the world do not have a sanctions office. They don't have sanctions professionals. And they, most importantly, do not have laws that allow them to impose sanctions, because sanctions, kind of at their core, they take away your assets. So when someone's sanctioned, their assets are no longer theirs. But sanctions are an administrative tool. So if you're sanctioned, it doesn't mean that marshals are going to come busting down your door and kick you out of their apartment. No, that's not going to happen. But if you're sanctioned, you have money in a bank, that money's not going anywhere. If you have property in the US and you're sanctioned, there will be a legal seizure proceeding that will commence. So countries, of course, some countries seize people's property without any due process, but in countries where there is some due process, they cannot just sanction you. And so the majority of the world's countries do not have their own sanctions regimes. Instead, what they do is they rely on the UN sanctions list for several reasons. One is it's pretty non-controversial. If sanctions are agreed to at the UN Security Council, it means that pretty much the whole world agrees on them. And so most of the people that you see on the UN Security Council list, which numbers about 1,000 names, they really are global pariahs. Like, the whole world has agreed that they are bad. And it's mostly terrorists, Al-Qaeda, ISIS, al-Nusra, but also some Iranians and some North Koreans. But there are no Russians. And why? Because Russia holds a seat on the UN Security Council. So Russia vetoes all sanctions against itself. Not even vetoes, they aren't even proposed because it's not going to go anywhere. So that is why 141 countries voted against the war at the UN, but only 46 levied sanctions. Sorry. Now, sanctions targeting Russia by type. So you see most of the sanctions are against individuals. And I mean, the reason for this is numerous. One, it's slightly easier to sanction individuals. A lot of the sanctions against individuals are Russian politicians. And the sanctions process generally is there's a certain executive order that gets written. And I'm talking about the US, but it's very similar in other countries. And the executive order will say, anyone who fits these criteria can be sanctioned. And so the new executive orders in relation to Russia's war in Ukraine, they say things like people that have supported the war in Ukraine who are Russian government officials. So that is then very easy to write a sanctions package because you simply have to say, okay, well, the Duma voted on this day and time, and these are all the Russian politicians that voted in favor of the war. So that's one, but still the number of entities is very large. Russia is an economy that does not have a lot of small and medium businesses, and a lot of the economy is controlled by state-owned institutions, whether these institutions are full or partial. And so most of the entities that you see there are a state kind of owned banks, enterprises, trading firms, and more. Now, I know this chart here is a lot to look at. Don't worry, we're not going to go deep into it. But these are the sectoral sanctions that we talked about earlier. These are the complicated ones. So I think what's most interesting here is go a little line by line is Russian energy imports. And I think this is something everyone has seen in the news, which is Russia's under all sorts of types of sanctions, but yet it is still selling oil and gas and coal to Europe and receiving enormous amounts of money. So Russia is continuing to fund its war. And even though it's April, it is still very cold in parts of Europe. And it's not just that Europe relies on Russian oil and gas for heating. Europe in large part relies on Russian oil and gas for electricity. So it's not even a question of like, well, can't they just put on sweaters? They could, but they might not be able to turn on the lights. So this is why you see countries that do not rely on Russia for energy and countries that do. Where you see much more kind of across the board action is financial. You see restrictions on Russian banking, correspondent accounts, trade revocation. So countries are a lot more willing to take financial action against Russia than on certain critical things like metals and energy. This is a kind of our simplest chart here, and also the most interesting, because Russia had a large amount of sanctions against it, before it invaded Ukraine for the second time. But now there's a lot more. And when we think about global pariahs, in January of this year, definitely, I don't think Russia would be considered a global pariah. I think every single other country on this list, you could say yes. But Russia is still, you could go major Western businesses, lots of trade, G20 member, etc. And the amount of sanctions that have been levied against Russia and by all the different major economies is really, I think, astounding. And it does show how seriously Europe takes this, because During the Trump administration, the sanctions policy of the US is very unilateral. It was whatever the president wants to do that day, and whatever he wrote on Twitter, that's kind of what the sanctions policy is going to be at the moment. And so there was not a lot of communication with European allies. The Biden administration has from the beginning said, we're going to be very multilateral, we're going to communicate with European allies, and has let really Europe kind of lead the process. But also what probably surprised Putin, and definitely surprised everyone else, is how quickly Europe united and how quickly Europe kind of decided to take aggressive measures. Now, some might still say, well, Europe isn't banning oil and gas. These are all half measures. They're not. Russia has lost hundreds of billions of dollars of its sovereign reserves. Its economy is going to contract by probably at least 20% this year. Many Russians that kind of have built middle-class lives, that has been destroyed in a matter of weeks, especially if they had worked for businesses, either Western businesses or businesses that relied on Western goods or on trade with the West. And I think a really good question to kind of ask, and there's not necessarily a straightforward answer here, but do sanctions work? And I don't actually like this question because it's too open-ended and generally doesn't have an objective set. So when thinking about sanctions and whether or not they work, well, what was the goal that was initially set? And I think that the best comparison for sanctions is the criminal justice system. It does not always work. It is not always effective, but it is a series of carrots and sticks. And so sanctions, I mean, the best comparison is like jail. Sometimes people do not commit crimes because they don't want to go to jail. And we know this. We know that jail is effective at making some people not commit crimes. Other times, people know that they're going to go into jail if they do something, and they still commit crimes. And other times, we don't know if jail was a factor or not. But what we can say for sure is if there was no threat of punishment for committing crimes whatsoever, you would definitely have more crimes. And with sanctions, I think it's a very similar conversation. So just because Putin invaded Ukraine doesn't mean that the sanctions, quote unquote, didn't work. I think the Biden administration's goal here was to prevent the war, but then two, if there was going to be a war, to impose serious costs on Russia. And this goes back to kind of the criminal justice analogy, which is, what if someone knows that there is going to be serious consequences for a crime and they go ahead and commit the crime anyways? You know, what do you do with that kind of a person? What do you do with a country when they are led by a type of person that doesn't care about these consequences? Like, you know, to kind of leave the sanctions realm for a moment, Putin is clearly willing to lay down as many lives, both Ukrainian and Russian, as necessary for whatever his goals are. He does not care. And he also does not care about Russia's economy. I'm not going to go into Putin's psychology, but you can't, if what you're taking away from somebody doesn't really matter to them, then it's very difficult to affect their decision-making process. At the same time, I would argue it doesn't mean we should just let people that act in a criminal manner enjoy the fruits of global economy and trade. I think it would have been absolutely reprehensible if Russia had invaded Ukraine as it had, and the global community would have said, well, Putin's not going to change his mind anyway, so let's not impose any sanctions because what the heck? That would have sent a very strong message to China that, well, China should go ahead and take Taiwan. So it is extremely important, I think, to level sanctions. I also think it's very important to set goals. And so to talk more about two cases where very clear goals were set and very clear goals were achieved, in very different cases. One is the JCPOA, also known as Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, also known as the Iran deal. So the Iran deal was worked on by the US and European partners, as well as China and Russia. And for many years, this global coalition put more and more pressure on Iran. So they targeted sanctions, sectoral sanctions, more targeted, more sectoral. At one point, there was a joke on Iranian Twitter that the only unsanctioned ones in Iran left are dogs. That because they were just like everything's sanctioned. What else are you going to sanction? And there was a deal achieved with the previous U.S. President Obama and President Rouhani in Iran. So there was years of pressure, years of diplomatic negotiations, and then there was a deal achieved. Now Trump canceled that deal, of course, as we all know, but the process was effective in terms of getting a deal achieved. So that's Obama administration and EU, Russian, Chinese allies. Very long-term and kind of difficult negotiations. A very different case is with an American who was arrested by the government of Turkey, Pastor Doyle Brunson. Pastor Doyle Brunson is a Christian pastor, and he was leading services in Turkey, and somebody there didn't like it, and they told him to stop, and he said no, and he was arrested. And so his case quickly made it to the US president, and the president, the embassy couldn't get him out in Turkey, and then State Department kind of elevated it to the president, and the president called up the Turkish president. President Trump called up Erdogan and said, "I'm going to sanction Turkish ministers and ruin your economy unless you let this one person out of jail." This was absolutely unprecedented because sanctions are typically used for kind of large geopolitical matters. It's kind of I wouldn't call all sanctions a financial nuclear bomb. Some can be, most aren't, but it's definitely like a financial cruise missile, if you will. Any sanction can ruin a person's, being sanctioned effectively ruins a person's life, unless that person is a billionaire or a terrorist that never had and never has had bank accounts. And the reason I put it at those two ends is somebody that doesn't have a bank account, well, sanctions aren't really going to touch them because they don't have assets. And somebody has a billionaire, well, they might lose $1 billion or $2 billion, but they're going to be okay. Everyone else, sanctions, very, very difficult for you. So Treasury has always resisted and never even thought about using sanctions in a case like this, but Trump used them for a very narrowly defined goal, getting this one person out of jail in Turkey. Now, Turks didn't listen. Trump sanctioned one minister. They didn't do anything. Trump sanctioned a couple more ministers. Pastor Doyle Brunson was on the first plane out of Turkey. So extremely effective. Maybe the most effective use of sanctions ever, because it was so quick and the goal was so narrow. And then the sanctions were lifted. So very much in line of Trump's thinking of kind of how do we make a deal, as opposed to this is a very sensitive tool that we shouldn't use. And that brings us kind of to back to Russia. What now? Right. So how long are these sanctions going to stay on? What is the effect of the sanctions going to be? I mean, how long they're going to stay on? I would probably say for at least two to 3 years. And I say that because even though this war hopefully doesn't last for 2 to 3 years, I also don't see Russia fully withdrawing from Ukraine and giving back all of the territory it has gained during this time. And I think you're going to have I also don't see Russia paying reparations. Like, Russia is not going to say sorry here, and Russia isn't going to give back what it's taken. And especially with the atrocities that have been uncovered, you have a very hard line, not of course in Ukraine, but also in Europe that's been developing, which is these sanctions come off when Russia gives back everything it's taken. Some people are even saying it should give back Crimea and eastern Ukraine, and kind of the territories it took in 2014, and that's almost certainly not going to happen. So, sanctions could stay on for years. There could be some sort of negotiated peace deal between Russia and Ukraine, where if Ukraine asks the world to reduce sanctions, then probably they will come off. So you could have political change in Ukraine or Russia that leads to it. But political change in Russia at this point means the death of Vladimir Putin, and right now he seems to at least have 10 to 20 years left. So that is kind of your worst case scenario. Although we don't know who would come after him, so that person might want to keep those territories as well. I mean, I could talk forever about this topic, but I want to just kind of and how am I in time? I think we start Q&A at 6:40.
You know what? We could start it now if you like. Sure. Carlo?
Okay, I just wanted to
Right.
say a couple more things, and then we'll get right to it. Sorry. So I wanted to also take the opportunity to speak for just 60 seconds about kind of Castellum AI. So we're a public benefit corporation. So what do? We provide free sanction screening. So I would encourage everyone to kind of go to our website after. It's Castellum.AI. It's free. And kind of why is it free? And why do we support data-driven journalism and provide a lot of information for free to reporters and academics? It's when I was at Treasury, my last job there was senior policy advisor for Iran, and that meant coordinating sanctions on Iran both domestically but also internationally. And I had this one moment where I had Undersecretary Chief of Staff come in and yell at me. It happened a lot, not because of incompetence, but it's like, hey, we have Japanese Prime Minister coming. I need a talking point that says, dear Shinzo Abe, add these Iranians to your watch list. So it sounds like a pretty simple question. You look at the US sanctions list, you look at the Japanese sanctions list, and you see what's the delta. And then you write a talking point. Like, there's 11 Iranians on the US sanctions list that are not on the Japanese sanctions list. And what I found out is that data is actually basically impossible to find. And it's kind of a very interesting thing, which is, and I encourage everyone after this webinar, go and try to find, let's say, Canada's sanctions list or the UN sanctions list and try to search something. It's extremely difficult. And then if you need to search multiple lists, it's practically impossible. So that's the mission of Castleman AI, is to make the data easily and freely publicly available. And so that's kind of what we've done. So with that, I will stop talking and hand it back over to Anne and Carla.
Okay, thank you so much, Peter. So I think that we have a couple of questions that came in that Carlo will start asking you.
Thanks so much for your presentation, Peter. That was fascinating. We have a question here in the chat. Do we know if Putin made preparations for Russia being hit by sanctions? Did he think that the war would be won by who could outlast the sanctions longest?
Yeah, it was a great question. So Russia has been preparing for sanctions since 2014. After kind of Russia's annexation of Crimea, Russia said, all right, we need to start sanction proofing the economy. Sorry. It did two major things. The first is they built a domestic payments network. So Visa and MasterCard are two largest payment networks in the world. And then there's a Chinese one and a Japanese one. I think the Chinese one is called Union Pay. And then I forget the name of the other one. But basically you have Visa, MasterCard dominate global payments. And then there's a Chinese and Japanese one, but those are mostly confined to those two countries. And Russia has previously been on Visa and MasterCard. And, they must have had some sort of very detailed and comprehensive sanctions planning or counter sanctions planning. They said, what happens if this gets worse? And they said, well, Visa and MasterCard leave the country and suddenly people can't, they can't buy things. Like they can use cash, and they can do wire transfers, but they can't do a credit, they can't buy anything at a store. And so Russia created its own kind of Visa alternative called Mir. And when Visa and MasterCard did leave the country last month, there was a lot of chaos, and a lot of cards stopped working, but Russia very quickly switched over to its domestic Mir network for most people. So that was effective. The other thing that Russia did was it essentially built up a $640 billion rainy day fund of cash, with the idea being we're going to, if this happens again and we lose a lot of money, we have $640 billion that will tide us over, which is a very good idea. The problem with this is they didn't have all of that money in Russia. And part of the reason they didn't have it in Russia is it's just standard practice when you are buying foreign currency to keep foreign currency in other places. So Russia was like, what do we want to do? Let's have dollars, let's have pounds, let's have Swiss francs, let's have Chinese renminbi, and let's have some gold and some rubles. So the dollars were held where? In New York, frozen. The Swiss francs were held in Switzerland, frozen. The pounds in the UK, frozen. The euros in Brussels and other European banks, frozen. So all of the money that they had in other places outside the country was largely frozen. And so that $640 billion rainy day fund is, nobody knows exactly, but the estimates are that they lost at least $200 billion, which is pretty significant hit. And then for the other currencies, like they have some Chinese yuan, and then they also have rubles and gold. So nobody wants rubles right now. So all of that money is useless to them. They can spend it domestically, but nobody wants rubles, not even in Russia. And certainly they can't use rubles to do any international trade. They can receive money in rubles, but they can't. Nobody's going to accept rubles to buy things. And then all their Chinese currency is very useful for only one thing, which is doing trade of China. So who does that benefit? That benefits only China. And the reason I say that is Russia is now locked out of a lot of markets, and they have all of this kind of rainy day fund in Chinese yuan. So if they want to buy things, they have only one place to do it. So if I'm a Chinese merchant right now, I'm pretty happy because I know they're going to spend that money with me. So those are the two main things that Russia did, which is build up this huge rainy day fund and build up its own payments network. And both of those things definitely are helping. Like it would have been a lot worse for Russia if they had not done so. So another question on, do you have a slide on sanctions-driven GDP impacts? So Nikki, I would never even try to do that, and the reason is that it is almost, I think, I would say impossible to do this accurately. I think Russia's invasion of Ukraine right now may offer like one of the only cases where you can actually measure here's the economy, let's say Q4 2021, and here's the economy Q2 2022 for Russia. But you have to, if we look at other cases like North Korea or Iran or Syria, like North Korea, these governments, first of all, never put out accurate statistics. So we can't know, did the economy really contract? Did it actually grow? How much of the market is black market? So one, you don't have good data. Two, there's generally other things which have also kind of made the situation worse. If we look at North Korea, right, before sanctions were even, before sanctions were even imposed in North Korea was already an autocratic or already a dictatorship with kind of a disastrous economy and then a famine. And if you look at Syria, right, the sanctions there were a result of the civil war. So did Syria's economy crater because of the sanctions or the civil war? Probably much more so the civil war, but the sanctions definitely didn't help. Now, with Iran, sanctions have been added onto Iran as kind of a drip over years. And then there's also factors where people may leave a country because the sanctions are generally imposed on countries where there's significant problems. So the sanctions really are the symptom. They are not the disease. Like the symptom is, countries financing terrorism, countries invading its neighbors, countries executing people with anti-aircraft guns. Like these are diseases, and then the symptoms are the U.S. and UN and others impose sanctions. But Aniki, to your point, I think people do these papers every so often. They're always very interesting, and they make for kind of interesting think pieces and discussions. But let me put it this way: I would always read them, but I would never write one.
Thanks, Peter. We have another question here in the chat. If individuals who have been sanctioned don't have liquid or fixed assets outside of Russia, what do sanctions accomplish? What exactly is affected by sanctions against individuals?
Yeah, so first of all, it is also a travel ban. You're basically a global persona non grata. So in a world where you can get on a plane and move your entire life from, if you have enough kind of liquid financial assets, from one place, you could be in Russia now and you could be in Venezuela, and from Venezuela to Colombia. It's very, very, very easy to move money and assets globally now, especially the more money you have. So first of all, when we think of, well, this person's in Russia, they don't have money outside of Russia. I would challenge that thought. For a lot of these Russian politicians who claim they don't have any assets outside of the country, they do. Now, are those assets under their names? Potentially not, but that's something which governments and intelligence agencies are now really focusing on. The other thing is sanctions, again, going back to the criminal justice system, is you are punishing someone and you're saying you can't play here anymore. Like, if you want to engage in this type of activity, then fine. There's no more vacations for you in the Alps. There's no more trips to New York. There's no more Chanel bags. Like, go ahead and enjoy all of these only Iranian or only Russian or North Korean goods. Like, there's a really interesting article in the New York Times, I think a few days ago, about how there was one of the top destinations for Russians was Venezuela, because there were not a lot of visa restrictions. There are not kind of travel or sanctions restrictions. Venezuela is not the first, second, or third place on almost any other country's destination list. So I think it has a tremendous impact. So just logistically, you're on a sanctions list. Even if you don't have assets, you can't travel. you can't travel globally, but two, it prevents you from using the world as your economic playground.
Thanks, Peter. We have a couple more questions coming in. We have, how long will it take Russia to recover from the current sanctions?
I mean, it's a great question, but I mean that really depends on kind of what Russia's going to do politically, and also, you know, what we mean by recover, because if Russia chooses, like Russia waged war in Afghanistan for 10 years. I worked in Afghanistan as a civilian intelligence analyst and translator, and it was kind of, I think it can be for people that are familiar with Russia's war in Afghanistan, I think a lot of us are very worried right now because one of Russia's, and I'm of Russian heritage, like one of Russia's greatest strengths is the willingness of its leaders to sacrifice Russian people. Like most other countries have a certain point where they're like, hey, we should probably stop having our citizens die, but Russian leadership has never, ever had that concern. And so depending kind of, let's just say politically, we don't know what will happen, but let's assume the situation is going to continue to be very bad politically for several years to come. Russia can get into a situation like Iran. They're pretty similar in that they're very large countries. They have a lot of oil and gas exports. They have very smart and educated populations. And I mean, people still, there's still new births in Iran. People go on vacations in Iran. People buy homes in Iran, build lives in Iran. But what Russia is going to see is a narrowing of opportunities. You will not be able to build the type of life in Russia that you used to be able to. You will not be able to build a type of life in Russia that you will be able to do, let's say, just across the border in Latvia or Poland. So it'll just be less goods, less financial opportunities, lower earnings, lower quality of life. Even things like streaming movies and playing online games are going to become difficult. So sanctions have never pushed a country into like collapse. That has never happened. But what it does is it makes everyone's life, when you have sanctions that are like Iran, North Korea, and that Russia level, it lowers the quality of living for everyone. And it does so for quite some time.
Are there any more questions? Carlo, do we have any?
There's a couple more in the Q&A box here. Is there a danger that Russia, China, and others simply move away from the dollar and move to another currency or to Bitcoin?
My short answer, great question. I think the short answer is no. Long answer is, so Bitcoin and cryptocurrency is actually tremendously traceable. People often associate Bitcoin and other cryptocurrency with like extreme financial crime, and for good reason, because that's kind of a lot of its recent history. But a major difference with Bitcoin and all these cryptocurrencies is there is the blockchain, essentially the transaction ledger, is public. And that means that if Russia were to use one of these cryptocurrencies, everyone could see exactly what they were doing, who they were sending money to, and it would be a lot easier to seize it and freeze it. So I think cryptocurrency is not the way to go here. In terms of moving to another currency, if I was China, I would say, hey, Russia, you know what? You should move to the yuan. And this is one thing which I think doesn't get enough attention, which is the country that has benefited the most from this war is China. because Russia and China, they are not allies. They just both don't like the US. And Russia has traditionally been the big brother in this relationship, even though it's a country with a much smaller population, but it has had a much more advanced economy. And also kind of during Soviet times, Russia was the one that really kind of mentored China. And now Russia has kind of nowhere to turn except for China. So with every kind of switching to another currency it's always difficult. Think of any time when you've traveled and how annoying it was to do a currency exchange, and also how expensive it was all the time, every time you lost money. And so when you speak about kind of moving to another currency, sure, Russia could, let's say, move to the yuan or try to use a third-party currency, but the question is, who wants it? Most people in the world want to use the dollar or the euro or the British pound. They want to use something which everyone else accepts. Why? Because if you're using something that everyone else accepts, you don't have to exchange the currency. You don't lose some of the value in the exchange. So that's the very long answer to the short no.
One more question in the Q&A box here. Anything preventing Russia from starting new trade deals or partnerships with countries that are more compatible with their ideology or just unfriendly to the US to help with what they are losing with the sanctions? Is there anything preventing Russia from starting new trade deals and partnerships with those countries?
Nothing at all. It's just they wouldn't be very good trade deals. Like there's a reason we're not all eating. We're all kind of, let's say, eating lots of really good Korean food, but it's all food and culture from the Republic of Korea, not North Korea. There's these countries don't have much in terms of goods to export. Even Russia, Iran and Russia are very good. North Korea has nothing to export but coal and slave labor. Those are its only two exports. And there already are North Korean slaves and the UN has actually done significant reporting on this. Basically, North Koreans are exported from the country. They work at, let's say, lumber mills in Russia. And if they do anything, their family members back home in North Korea are shot. So Russia already has trade deals like that with North Korea. But with Venezuela and Iran, these are also petro states. So they don't, other than energy, they don't export much of anything. So, their options are like, they can trade oil and gas back and forth with each other. So there's just not much of a trade deal. And then, if Russia wants to do things in Afghanistan, I think they've already done that. It's kind of like yes, you can do it, but what are you going to benefit? And they are going to do something like that, and they'll get some press releases and people write articles, but it's not going to make up in any way, shape, or form for what they've lost because of the sanctions.
And last question here. Is there any way that innocent citizens can be protected from the negative consequences of sanctions against unelected governments?
I think it's a great question, Doug. I think the question is protected by whom? So I think the countries that impose sanctions generally have something called licenses built into the sanctions. So the sanctions will say, like, you can't do business with these bad people or in Russia, but you can send medicines and you can send food. But who is going to want to send medicine and food to Russia? Definitely some people, and there are people that it's often overlooked, but despite all the sanctions over the last 20 years, the US and Iran actually do. It's not a large amount of trade, but it's a couple $100 million. It's mostly actually the US sending grain. So US farmers from the Midwest have been for the last 2 decades selling grain to Iran, which Iran has been buying. There's there are all these exceptions that the US, EU, Canada, and others create to mitigate the consequences. I think the best word is to mitigate. But at the end of the day, the only way to really protect yourself is to leave. Because a jurisdiction that is under significant sanctions, it is bad. Quite simply, like, and I would just maybe end on the note that sanctions are generally not an end in themselves. They're a tool that helps achieve a political end, just like war, right? War is not generally just for war. It's a tool to achieve a political end. And there have been sanctions on Iran and North Korea for, I mean, at this point, over 20 years. And so the best thing, if people in North Korea, they can't leave, but if you were an Iranian who wanted to live a good quality of life, the best choice for you would be to leave. So it's just, it's not something that can be protected against.
So, Peter, thank you so much for sharing your experience with us today and for giving us this very interesting survey of the sanctions process, your insights on this fascinating global economic situation. So, and I'm sure that your website will also provide much valuable information on.
Thank you, and my pleasure.
Okay. So our next event, Carlo, can you put that up for us, please? Oh, if you wanted to become a member of UNA New York, those of you who are listening, and you're not a member, we would love to have you. And you can find us at UNA-NYC.org. And we have an event coming up on April 21st, a film that we will be showing with a Q&A afterwards on Bhutan. So those of you who are interested and would like to join, we'd love to have you. So thank you very much again, Peter, and for all of you for joining us this evening. Okay.
Thank you, Anne. Thank you, Carlo, and thank you, everyone.
Have a good night, everyone.